Hey everyone, I'm Benjamin and welcome to my book club. We just finished reading part 4 of Red Mars by Stanley Robinson, and I've got a bit to talk about this part, so let's just jump right into the recap, shall we? New part, new viewpoint character. That's really exciting. I really enjoy seeing this from different viewpoints, and what's more, I need to read a book with 5 different viewpoint characters as part of my bingo challenge this year. So if we get, if the pattern continues and we get another viewpoint character, because I believe we're at 4. We saw from Frank, Maya, Nadia, and now Michel. Then I'll hit 5 and I'll have my bingo square, so that'd be great. For part 4, we're inside the head of Michel Duval, the French psychiatrist that's come along with the original 100 colonists. And I think in this part we begin to see that only sending one psychiatrist was perhaps a mistake. First up, we have our opening passages. These have always been somewhat about science, geology, that sort of thing. In this case, we're talking about life and the life that is now growing on Mars. Specifically, we talk about the adaptability and the tenacity of life, such as lichen and mosses. We talk about the genetic engineering that went into them and the selective breeding that generates these new strains that are allowed to live on Mars. We talk about how fast and rapidly they can go through generations, going through hundreds of generations in a day, mutating either naturally or through introduced mutagens that allow them to better survive on Mars. It isn't said exactly how long has passed since part 3, but it feels like it might have been quite a long time. It feels like it might have been a number of years. If anyone knows exactly how long has passed between part 3 and part 4, then let me know, I might have just missed it. But one part talks about how in this time the mosses and the lichen and algae on Mars have taken hold. One scene in particular talks about the wall of one of the big trenches, one of the big chasms, and how it is now covered in yellows and greens and blacks, colours that had never been on Mars before in our lifetimes, and now dominate the landscape. Our first moments with Michel Duval really set us up for who he is as a character and kind of the theme of this part. We first meet him as he dreams of a beach back home in France, as he dreams of the life that he misses and the life that he once led, and then is woken up to the colony, to Underhill, to Mars. Michel Duval is suffering from severe homesickness in this part. He is depressed, he's melancholic, he's down, he seems to be almost running on autopilot. He makes frequent references to the Michel program that is running in his head and just giving back the responses that is expected of him as he struggles with this new life that he thought he wanted. Michel gets woken up by a call from Nadia and Phyllis. It seems that Maya is again in hysterics and throwing a fit about her love triangle between John, Frank and herself. Michel, as the only psychiatrist, wakes up, gets dressed and meets Maya in his office. As Maya complains again to Michel about her problems with Frank and John, Michel finds it hard to concentrate on Maya's problems. He finds himself drifting, thinking about how intimate the relationship between a therapist and a patient are. That intimacy isn't sexual contact, but rather this divulging of feelings and thoughts that you wouldn't share to anyone else. And that as the only psychiatrist on Mars, he's providing this for many people. But his psychiatrist that he talks to is back on Earth, back in France, a 15-minute delay. He misses speaking his own language. There's no one on Mars right now that speaks French. Frank thinks he does, but his French is terrible and is worse than hearing no French at all. Michel goes on to somewhat, at least within his own head in my opinion, betray that intimacy with Maya by thinking of her, I believe he calls her crazy at certain points, crazy but sexy, really objectifying her. He talks about how she comes from a line of Russian women who are in their own way crazy about men. They need them but they can't stand them, they push them away but they need them. And Michel finds it very difficult to focus on Maya's problems or to even really care about them, because as he says in his own head, next week she'll be back with different but strikingly similar problems. To interrupt this, Michel invites Maya to go for a walk, and we get a real good sense of the changes that have taken place in Underhill and the surrounding colony during the time period that we've skipped. For example, the alchemist's quarter is now almost dominated by these giant salt pyramids. Some of the processes of the transmutation and the creation and the construction that they do here, and the chemistry, one of the byproducts is salt. and it's clear that they make too much of it. They don't know what to do with it. Sachs promises that he's working on solutions. Right now they're being used to just mix in with building material, but it's not a very efficient use of this byproduct, and so it is just piled up in these waste pyramids. They walk over to a lichen farm. There's these giant trenches filled with lichen and moss that is being grown and harvested and mutated by the biochemist and the farmers to try and develop new strains that will better help them terraform the planet. Looking down upon a particularly green patch, Michel thinks to himself about how he remembers Hiroko, the head of the farming initiative, seeing it and pointing to it and naming it 𝕬𝕬𝕤, which means greenery, growth, vitality. Next, Maya and Michel visit Nadia at her new construction project. Nadia's new construction project is a trench, almost a kilometre long, very wide, bigger and deeper than Underhill, and it's designed to make the next permanent settlement on Mars. It's larger, it's longer, and the defining factor is one of the edges of this trench is dominated by a series of mirrors, which will filter and then reflect the sunlight into the actual shelters, so the shelters themselves will have natural light as opposed to the unnatural light that Underhill suffers from. Maya talks about how her life on Mars feels unreal, almost like a simulation, a dream, and Michel gives the appropriate therapist answers without any thought to them, but thinks to himself that he's suffering from the exact opposite problem. Every moment on Mars is too real. He can't escape being on Mars. The cold reminds him that he is on Mars at all times and makes him wish for the life that he'd left behind. It's during this visit with Nadia that Michel starts to talk about his theory of personalities that he's been developing. His theory really starts off with talking about stable and labile people. As an aside, I'm not sure if it's pronounced labile or labile because it's French, but it is the opposite of stable, so unless that's pronounced stabile, I'm pretty sure it's stable and labile, just like labile being the opposite of stable. In this moment, he's comparing Nadia and Maya. Nadia as this very stable person, someone whose emotions and feelings and mental health isn't drastically affected by outside influences. And he sees Maya as this labile person who outside influences, especially from people like John and Frank, send her into hysterics, really affect her mental health and her well-being. Michel expands upon this, also introducing the idea of introverted and extroverted personalities, and we're gonna have to talk about these graphs, aren't we? So the book now has a series of graphs which help to show Michel's thought patterns and then eventual theory. I'll put up a couple of the graphs right now. In essence, Michel's theory is that by combining the stable, labile, introverted and extroverted parts of someone's personality, they can be grouped into one of 4 different groups, which he's named after the historic sort of proto-psychiatry names for temperaments that were like based on humours. You have the sort of ideal colonists that he believes that people were looking for, that people were pretending to be to get onto this group, and that would be the people that are stable and are extroverted. They're more likely to get along with each other and they're less likely to have mental issues because of outside influences. He names these people sanguine, and he references people like John as being sanguine. Next are the stable introverts, people that perhaps pretended to be a bit more extroverted during the trial and selection period, but as Michel points out, that they wanted brilliant scientists, and very often brilliant scientists are introverted, not extroverted. These people he labels as phlegmatic. This includes people like Nadia and Hiroko and Sachs, brilliant people who are perhaps more introverted than they let on during the selection period, but are still stable, well-meaning people who aren't going to be very affected by this environment. Next up are the label extroverted people, the people who are very communal, that allow outside influences to affect them a lot, and he points to people like Frank and Maya as these people that have emotional swings and attachments to other people. And then finally, people like himself, and he groups Anne in this group as well, the introverts who are labile, introverted people who aren't very stable, and he names them melancholic. And he highlights that these are probably the worst sort of people to be here, and that they're not very happy. While thinking about his theory and bemoaning his homesickness, Michel starts to lose time. He starts to lose tracks of time in his mind, At one moment he's standing at the airlock. At the next he's by one of the great salt pyramids in the alchemist quarters. He doesn't remember walking here. He doesn't remember deciding to come here. But he takes it in stride and just wanders up. He then loses more time, and next he's in the TV room and he's imagining himself having a romantic relationship with Maya. And it seems that over the course of perhaps even a full year, maybe longer, Michel is just operating on autopilot. He's losing large tracts of time and it's jumping, and he is falling deeper and deeper and deeper into this depression and this melancholy. He often thinks about how sad he was back on Earth, how he didn't appreciate the time he had, and instead spent that time dreaming of coming to Mars and working to coming to Mars without realizing that the life he wanted to lead was the life he was leading. And he is full of regrets and depression. And it's in one of his deepest moments of this that he gets awoken one night. He gets awoken by a man he's never seen before, a dark-skinned man with dreadlocks. At first he thinks it might be one of the new colonists that may have arrived that's broken into Underhill, but that doesn't make any sense to him. He questions the man, "Who are you?" And the man replies, "I'm the stowaway." If we remember back to part 2, I think, Maya thought she saw someone on the Ares, someone stowing away on the Ares, and we haven't really touched back on that, except for in part 3 where Nadia thought that perhaps the habitat that was dropped for them had already been lived in, that there were pieces and parts moved. And here we seem to maybe be introduced to the actual stowaway. The mysterious man leads Michel to the farm. And in the farm, Michel sees children moving amongst the plants and crops. There should be no children on Mars. They didn't bring any with them, and they aren't supposed to be making children here. But there's several children here, and he sees them, and it's confusing. And finally he finds the group of farmers under Hiroko, and they're kneeled on the ground in a religious ceremony of sorts. They're naked, and they're lit by the stars, and they invite him to kneel with them. Michel removes his clothes, kneels with them, as Hiroko appears. Hiroko deposits soil into each of their hands, which, while Hiroko chants some religious chant, people begin to eat. Michel follows suit, eats the soil in his hands. What follows is a series of chanting and religious embracing and almost perhaps an orgy of sorts. And at the end of this, Hiroko informs him they've created a religion of sorts, where they worship the 𝕤𝕤𝕤 as almost like sort of like a kami from old Japanese religions. And that they've created a secret, safe place in the south where they can create their community the way they want it, where they can strive to change their world into the way they wish to see it, and the way they think Michel wishes to see it. And she invites him to join them, and Michel accepts. And Michel has been inducted into the Erophany, this sort of religious cult that has surrounded Hiroko. Alright, quite a short part this time, but pretty dense. I'm a bit disappointed that we seem to have had a big time jump. I was really, really enjoying where we were at the end of part 3, and I was really hoping we would just pick up immediately. Hopefully we get some of that background in the next part. But what we did get here, I did really enjoy. I loved Michel's homesickness. It felt very real. It felt like the sort of problem that, yeah, you're gonna experience. The idea that they only sent one psychiatrist and his only form of therapy to help is on a 15-minute time lag is depressing and sad for Michel. And I think there's probably many people in this sort of situation that would realise that, like Michel, the life they were leading back on Earth was the life that they would have liked. And if they could have just stopped for a second and stopped wishing for this life on Mars and aiming for it and striving for it, then they might have realised they were just happy where they were. Okay, so now the stuff at the end with the stowaway and Hiroko and the children and the Erophany, was that real? I can't tell yet. It all had a very dreamlike sense to it, and Michel's clearly not in the best state of mind, so I'm not sure if any of that actually happened or if it was a hallucination. Presumably in the next part we might see a bit more about what's going on there. There have been mentions before of people being worried that the farmers surround Hiroko in almost a sort of religious cult-like manner, but this seems to be taking it to quite an extreme. And how would they have constructed a whole settlement in the south without anyone knowing? I mean, I'm sure it's possible. I'm really interested. I want to hear more about this stowaway character, if he is real. I want to know about these children. Are these children that the farmers have had while here? Are the children real? It's the children that make me think that most of all that this isn't real, because they just seemed so hallucinatory. No talk of Arcady in this part, no talk of Phobos, no real talk about a very small amount of talk about the new colonies that might be being set up. There's one set up a bit farther to the north. It seems that only one group of people have run into them. We were very much in kind of like a bottle episode this time, weren't we? Just inside Michel's head, dealing with his problems, which is fine. I enjoyed that quite a lot, but I'm really looking forward to the next part. I really hope we get back to this talk we were having at the end with Nadia and Arcady, like, on their way back to the colony after finding out that the terraforming project's been approved. I hope we find out who was hiding the moss and stuff inside the windmills from part 3. But overall, part 4, I did enjoy it. I'm still really enjoying this book. So let me know what you guys think. How are you following the book so far? What did you think of part 4? It was quite a short part, but I think part 5 is a bit longer, so it'll make up for it. So yeah, I'll see you guys in 2 weeks with part 5. I'm really excited to be reading this. At times it can feel a little bit long-winded, but mostly I'm finding it really exciting and enjoyable. And it is hitting on those sort of societal and emotional levels that I wanted to hit on. I hope we hear some more about corporations and like Earthside interests in what's going on Mars. And I'd love if the next part digs into sort of the intra-colony communications and relationships with the new colonists that arrive and the new colonies that get set up. I'd love some sort of political bickering to take place. I love that sort of stuff in books. But yeah, if you've missed any of the earlier parts, then I don't know why you're still watching this, but the playlist is right here. And most of all, just remember to keep reading.